Chapter 8 of The Country Beyond. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Country Beyond by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 8. Peter, thrust back from the door through which his master had gone, listened vainly for the sound of returning footsteps in the beat of rain and the crash of thunder outside. A strange thing had burned itself into his soul, a thing that made his flesh quiver and set hot fires running in his blood. As a dog sometimes senses the stealthy approach of death, so he began to sense the tragedy of this night that had brought with it not only a chaos of blackness and storm, but an anguish which roused an answering whimper in his throat as he turned toward Nada. She was crumpled with her head in her arms, where she had flung herself with Jolly Roger's last kiss of worship on her lips, and she was sobbing like a child with its heart broken. And beside her knelt the old gray missioner, man of God in the deep forest, who stroked her hair with his thin hand, whispering courage and consolation to her, with the wind and rain beating overhead and the windows rattling to the accompaniment of ghostly voices that shrieked and wailed in the tree-tops outside. Peter trembled at the sobbing, but his heart and his desire were with the man who had gone. In his unreasoning little soul it was Jed Hawkins who was rattling the windows with his unseen hands, and who was pounding at the door with the wind, and who was filling the black night with its menace and fear. He hated this man, who lay back in the trail with his lifeless face turned up to the deluge that poured out of the sky. And he was afraid of the man, even as he hated him, and he believed that Nada was afraid of him, and that because of her fear she was crying there in the middle of the floor, with Father John patting her shoulder and stroking her hair, and saying things to her which he could not understand. He wanted to go to her. He wanted to feel himself close against her, as Nada held him so often in those hours when she had unburdened her grief and her unhappiness to him. But even stronger than this desire was the one to follow his master. He went to the door and thrust his nose against the crack at the bottom of it. He felt the fierceness of the wind fighting to break in, and the broken mist of it filled his nostrils. But there came no scent of Jolly Roger McKay. For a moment he struggled at the crack with his paws. Then he flopped himself down, his heart beating fast, and fixed his eyes inquiringly on Nada and the missioner. His 4.5 months of life in the big wilderness, and his weeks of constant comradeship with Jolly Roger, had developed in him a brain that was older than his body. No process of reasoning could impinge upon him the fact that his master was an outlaw, but with the swift experiences of tragedy and hiding and never-ceasing caution had come instinctive processes which told him almost as much as reason. He knew something was wrong tonight. It was in the air. He breathed it. It thrilled in the crash of thunder, in the lightning fire, in the mighty hands of the wind rocking the cabin and straining at the windows. And vaguely the knowledge gripped him that the dead man in the trail was responsible for it all, and because of this something that had happened, his mistress was crying and his master was gone. And he believed he should also have gone with Jolly Roger into the blackness and mystery of the storm, to fight with him against the one creature in all the world he hated, the dead man who lay back in the thickness of gloom between the forest walls. And the missioner was saying to Nada, in a quiet, calm voice, out of which the tragedies of years had burned all excitement and passion, "God will forgive him, my child. In his mercy he will forgive Roger McKay, because he killed Jed Hawkins to save you. But man will not forgive. The law has been hunting him because he is an outlaw, and to outlawry he has added what the law will call murder. But God will not look at it in that way. He will look into the heart of the man who sacrificed himself." And then fiercely Nada struck up the missioner's comforting hand, and Peter saw her young face white as stardust in the lampglow. "I don't care what God thinks," she cried passionately. "God didn't do right today. Mr. Roger told me everything, that he was an outlaw and I oughtn't to marry him. But I didn't care. I loved him. I could hide with him. And we were coming to have you marry us tonight when God let Jed Hawkins drag me away to sell me to a man over on the railroad, and it was God who let Mr. Roger go back and kill him. I tell you he didn't do right. He didn't. He didn't, because Mr. Roger brought me the first happiness I ever knew, and I loved him, and he loved me, and God was wicked to let him kill Jed Hawkins." Her voice cried out, a woman's soul broken in a girl's body, and Peter whimpered and watched the missioner as he raised Nada to her feet and went with her into his bedroom, where a few minutes before he had lighted a lamp. And Peter crept in quietly after them, and when the missioner had gone and closed the door, leaving them alone in their tragedy, Nada seemed to see him for the first time, and slowly she reached out her arms. "Peter," she whispered. "Peter, Peter." In the minutes that followed, Peter could feel her heart beating. Clutched against her breast, he looked up at the white, beautiful face, the trembling throat, the wide open blue eyes staring at the one black window between them and the outside night. A lull had come in the storm. It was quiet and ominous stillness, and the ticking of a clock, old and gray like the missioner himself, filled the room. And Nada, seated on the edge of Father John's bed, no longer looked like the young girl of 17 going on 18. That afternoon, in the hidden jackpine open, with its sweet-scented jasmines, its violets and its crimson strawberries under their feet, the soul of a woman had taken possession of her body. In that hour the first happiness of her life had come to her. She had heard Jolly Roger McKay tell her those things which she already knew, that he was an outlaw, and that he was hiding down on the near edge of civilization because the Royal Mounted were after him farther north, and that he was not fit to love her, and that it was a crime to let her love him. It was then the soul of the woman had come to her in all its triumph. She had made her choice, definitely and decisively, without hesitation and without fear. And now, as she stared unseeingly at the window against which the rain was beating, the woman in her girlish body rose in her, mightier than in the hour of her happiness, fighting to find a way, crying out for the man she loved. Her mind swept back in a single flash through all the years she had lived, through her years of unhappiness and torment as the foster girl of Jed Hawkins and his broken, beaten wife. Through summers and winters that had seemed ages to her, eternities of desolation, of heartache, of loneliness, with the big wilderness her one friend on earth. As the window rattled in a fresh blast of storm, she thought of the day months ago when she had accidentally stumbled upon the hiding place of Roger McKay. Since that day he had been her God, and she had lived in a paradise. He had been father, mother, brother, and at last, what she most yearned for, a lover to her. And this day, when for the first time he had held her in his arms, when the happiness of all the earth had reached out to them, God had put it into Jed Hawkins' heart to destroy her, and Jolly Roger had killed him. With a sharp little cry she sprang to her feet, so suddenly that Peter fell with a thump to the floor. He looked up at her, puzzled, his jaws half agape. She was breathing quickly. Her slender body was quivering. Suddenly Peter saw the fire in her eyes and the flame that was rushing into her